Well, hi everyone, and welcome to Ask and Wonder, an online show now that brings Christians and non-Christians together to have conversations about the biggest questions in life. And today we have for our first online interview our friend Micah Redding. Micah Redding is Executive Director of the Christian Transhumanist Association, and I look forward to hearing about his thoughts about everything that is happening and how technology is helping us, and learning about him and what he does with the Christian Transhumanist Association. Micah, thank you very much for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Pedro. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to talk about this stuff. So,
Yeah. Well, first of all, I would like to ask you, Micah, would you tell us a little bit about your background and actually how you actually became a Christian?
yeah. So I grew up as a preacher's kid in the Churches of Christ, and um, so what that meant is mostly small rural congregations, kind of all over the country. And so I grew up moving. I lived in West Virginia, Ohio, Alabama, I think Kentucky, Oklahoma, Oregon,
Mm.
Washington, like all over the place. And so I got to experience life in a lot of different kinds of churches, a lot of different versions of that. But the big thing is that what I heard consistently from my parents and from my Sunday school teachers and all this was that I really had to study for myself.
Mm.
And so I took that seriously, I think more seriously than most people expected. And so from a pretty young age, I was studying everything that I felt like was important to really kind of fit together into a worldview, which was, science and philosophy and theology and religion and the Bible itself and all this stuff. And so by the time I was 12, I started to wonder if I was going to become an atheist,
Mm.
because I looked around and everyone I knew who had been reading this kind of stuff became an atheist, right? Like I was reading these works of Bertrand Russell and all these kind of
Mhm.
classic atheists and so forth, and their criticisms of religion. And so I started to wonder if I was going to become an atheist, but I never did. And instead, I just kind of had this, what I call a rolling deconstruction, which is just this process of kind of continually trying to learn and come to grips with what faith is and what faith means. And so I was kind of moved to be baptized at a young age. But then as a teenager, I really kind of felt like I came to a really much deeper understanding of what faith actually was, through the works of people like C.S. Lewis and Chesterton and things like that. And so that's kind of a little bit of my faith journey.
Mm.
Um, and it's kind of what led me into some of these discussions that we have now. So, yeah.
I know that you have the opportunity to have great conversations with amazing Christian and non-Christian thinkers. And you mentioned something interesting. Why do you think, Micah, when people start exploring beyond faith, there is there seems to be a propensity for people to abandon faith when they start
Mhm.
discovering other ways of thinking about the world? Why do you think that happens?
Yeah, so I think I have a different opinion on this than most people do.
Mm.
So I think the people who are most likely to lose faith are the people who study religion.
Mm.
Uh, and the it's the same as if you studied your family history.
Mm.
You might be likely to develop some different opinions about some of your relatives than the idealized version that you used to have, right? If you
Yeah.
really dug in, you would figure out, oh well, maybe that uncle wasn't like, oh, I was thinking he was, and maybe like maybe oh, there's a criminal in my background and all this kind of stuff. And so when you look at the thing that kind of makes up your world,
Mm.
your source of meaning, well, all of a sudden you start to, like, you're shaking the pillars of your own kind of world, right? And
Yeah,
that's a problem. And it's hard to do that while you're sitting in it.
I see.
And so most people end up stepping out of it and then maybe they come back in a different sense or something like that. And so I think when we study science, that throws a lot of questions, but it's less that science itself is the challenge. It's more that what it makes us do is look at our religion and look very deeply. And then when we do that, we're questioning the thing and it's a real balancing act. It gets really tricky for a lot of people.
Yeah, it's like adding a new layer of understanding of things.
Mm-hmm.
That's very insightful. So, Micah, in your journey, when did you realize that transhumanism was something important that you wanted to lean to?
Yeah. So one of the big transitions for me and my kind of spiritual journey was really kind of digging into writers like I mentioned, C.S. Lewis, people like N.T. Wright and so forth, who are really interested in what Christianity has to say about the material world, right? And so they talk about, what does the Bible actually say we're looking forward to in terms of, is it immaterial or material, these kinds of things, but also like just anchored in the idea of the resurrection of Christ, Christ bodily coming out of the grave. What does this mean? Well, it means that God is concerned about the physical world, the material world, not just the spiritual world. That in fact, Christianity has a lot to say about the material world. And really, when I started thinking deeply about that, I realized, okay, well, that means that science and technology and all this stuff has to have a part to play. Like we can't leave that out of the picture, right? This is part of the material world that and technology and science are part of the thing that humans do in the material world. This is part of the Christian story, and we've got to figure out what that looks like. And shortly after I started really thinking in those terms, I started finding these secular transhumanist communities online. And these were people who, for the most part, had, many of them had an experience with faith, but left it behind because it was a bad experience. And they had some kind of experience where the people they were, the church they had experienced or the faith that they had experienced was escapist. It was anti-science. It was, not about doing anything good in the world. And they were really trying to find a way to hold on to some of the beautiful things they found in faith, while simultaneously using this really aggressively in science and technology. And so I recognized what had gone on there, right? Like that these people had experienced the loss of faith and were trying to in some ways reformulize it in this context of like, how do we make a better world? How do we build, good things? And I was like, oh, well, what you need is a better version of Christianity than what you've been exposed to. And at that time, when I started talking with people, there were very few people who were engaged with this at all. Like Christians were not, anywhere on the radar. This was just a very secular culture. And just over the last 2 decades, really, I've been, in this process of coming to try to interface Christians and secular people in that space much more deeply, so we can really kind of understand a lot more about the world and what we should be doing in it and so forth.
So Micah, would you define for us what transhumanism is? Because before saying secular transhumanism or Christian transhumanism, there's a transhumanism, right? That encompasses the whole idea, right? So will you tell us a little bit about transhumanism?
Yeah, so essentially it's transhumanism is, it's a worldwide movement to use science and technology to transform the human condition, right? So that's where it gets the name transhumanism. And it's kind of philosophically going a bit beyond humanism, which is kind of celebrating the human experience. And it's saying, well, but let's fix some things about the human experience. Let's make some things better. So as I mentioned, most people who are involved with this movement are very secular. It's a very secular movement. What we've done Christians like me and others have said, okay, well, this sounds good, like using science and technology to advance good, to make a better world, all that sounds good. So which direction are we going to take that?
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
like, where does that go? And that's a big discussion in the transhumanist movement, is like, where are we steering towards?
Yeah,
And
because
so,
it suppose a moral compass, it suppose
yeah,
decisions, right? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And these kind of ethical and moral debates are a big part of it. Um, and so we said, okay, so what would it look like if Christians were in that discussion, saying, okay, let's steer in the direction of what Christ would want, right? Like
Mm.
what Christ would lay out. What if we took that as our moral compass?
Hmm.
And that was what we kind of offered this conversation. And so that's the difference between there's different kinds of ethical transhumanisms out there, and most of them are secular transhumanism, and
Mm.
Christian transhumanism says let's use science and technology as called for by Christ, right? Like
Hmm.
in the direction of what Christ would want and call us to.
I think people, Micah, are going to be very interested in hearing how you actually started seeing the potential of transhumanism when you were reading the Bible and
Mm-hmm.
reading the letters, for example, of Paul, the Gospel.
Mm-hmm.
How you started to see that transhumanism was an idea that was jumping out the pages?
Yeah, so I see it like I see things that connect with this all through scripture. So the biggest thing for me is just Genesis 1, right?
Mm,
Where Genesis 1, we have a really, if you study like the different creation stories of different cultures and religions, they're very different. Um, and the Genesis story gives us a picture of God creating purely out of love, right? God God. He says, "Let there be light," and he says this, and he sees what is produced, and he says, "It is good," and he names it, and he categorizes it, and he classifies it, and he blesses it, right? All these things, and then God says, "Okay, now I'm going to create a being in my image, in my likeness, and I'm going to give it the same job. I'm going to give it the job of creating and cultivating life, of categorizing and naming creation, of blessing the life in the world and all this." And so that's the call in Genesis 1. And it's a call that intrinsically involves science and technology. You know, that's kind of, I call
mm.
that science and technology in their primordial form. If we are out there, you know, and what is the first thing that Adam does? God brings the animals to Adam to see what he will name them, right? Just as
Taxonomy.
God in Genesis 1 is naming and categorizing, and then in Genesis 2, he says, okay, now you do this, right? You are going to name and categorize. And so this is the work of science, and God calls them to, you know, tend and cultivate the garden, and God calls them to fill the earth and bring life and all this kind of stuff. And I think that's really the picture of what humanity was originally placed here for, to partner with God in this kind of scientific and technological, life-bringing, creative work. And I think, you know, I think historically the people who really were kind of foundational in science were people who looked at that story and said, "Oh yeah, this is what we're supposed to be doing.
Mm,
This is what we were created to do, the image of God." And I think that, you know, carries forward. You know, I like to talk about just the story of Noah's Ark. We talk about this story a lot, but
mm,
we don't really think about it. It's a story where um, the whole earth is in danger, and God calls one person to construct the largest technological artifact the ancient world could have ever imagined, to save all life, right? This is like straight out of a sci-fi movie, right? Like this is the picture. And so he does this giant technological construction project, and it's again, like just like Genesis 1, the animals come to him. God calls the animals to him, and he protects them. in this giant technological project. And then together, Noah and God and the technology and the animals, like that saves the world, right? That's the Bible's first kind of like picture of what redemption looks like, of what God is seeking to do with humanity,
Mm-hmm.
is to partner with us and call us to this kind of work so that we can, and when Noah comes out of the ark, God reiterates the blessing. He says, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. It's the same thing he told Adam. He's saying, that was it. That was the thing. You use your technology, you use your creative power to help cultivate the life of the world in partnership with me. That's it. Like do that. That's the picture. And I think we see that. I think the New Testament is just full of allusions to what that is, right? To saying this is what we were here for. Let's do more of this, right? Less of this other stuff we've been doing for the last few thousand years. Like, let's do more of this creative, life-giving work. And I think when you look at Christian history, Jesus called his disciples to, heal the sick, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, all this stuff. And you see Christians going out into the world and doing exactly that. And very quickly they say, okay, that means we need to build hospitals. That means we need to start doing scientific research, right? That means we need to start working on medicine. That means like all these things. Now we need to start working on agriculture, and we need to, like all that kind of stuff comes out of this understanding that science, technology, healing, medicine, all of this is part of what it means to be made in the image of God.
Wow. That is very interesting. I would like to ask you about that. One more question before we move on to what is happening today in the world, Micah. So in your perspective, we as humans, of course, we're supposed to transform the world, but then also have the potential to transform it beyond death, to overcome death through this transformation. It is something that the Christian transhumanism tries to posit.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that I think is when I first started talking with people about this, a lot of Christians would ask me about this, and I said, our secular transhumanist friends are not theologically trained, right? Right? Because that's not their job.
Definitely.
But they're trying to figure out how to talk about some of the things they're looking forward to. And they're looking to theological terms to do that. Right. And this is what every movie does. This is what, Armageddon, with Ben Affleck, right? Like that's a theological term. It's not really the same thing, but but so what needs to happen is that Christians, when we kind of enter that conversation, what we don't want to do is just say, okay, well, you got it all wrong, like everything, but we want to say, okay, here's a better way to think about these terms. Here's a better way to understand things. So one of the things that is an extension of medical science is something that's called life extension, or sometimes radical life extension. And a few years ago, we had at our conference, we had Aubrey de Grey, who's a scientist working in this field. And basically what he's saying is like all the diseases we have, cancer and heart disease and dementia, which are like the largest killers in the world, those trace back to cellular damage that's always accumulating. And so he believes that if we could figure out ways to address the cellular damage, rather than waiting until it turns into cancer or something like that, what we would have done is really incredibly extend aging, and most importantly, or rather lifespan. Most importantly, not just extend lifespan, but actually extend what's called health span, right?
Okay.
So right now, the majority of medical expenses are spent in the last year of someone's life, and it doesn't buy them that much time. It doesn't buy them that much productivity or relationship or whatever. And so what we want to do, in the medical field is we want to say, well, we want more productive, creative, relational life. if we can get that, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
the kind of life we're interested in. People get to spend more time with their families, more time, helping the world, all that kind of stuff. And, so that's talking about radically extending life. And we don't know yet what that might look like. From 1900 to 2000, we doubled life expectancy.
Mm-hmm.
And we really radically changed how people age and die. And we might do that again with our technologies.
Yeah.
And if we are doing that and it's giving healthy, productive relational life, that is, I think, absolutely good. What I want to, the theological thing that I want to clarify there is that long life is not equivalent to immortality.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
These are not the same things. And sometimes people talk about it as immortality because, again, we're like, using terms. But it's not. Immortality in the, I think the Gospel of John, Jesus says, this is eternal life, to know you and the one you have sent. Right. And that's talking about a relationship. And I think I argue, especially like in all these discussions, ultimately, the only thing that buys you actual immortality is being in the right kind of relationship. And so radical life extension, longevity, like health span, all of that is a great and good thing that I would support. But we want to clarify kind of what that actually means and what that actually is.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that is very interesting. So one more quick question. Something that you try to do with the Christian Transhumanist Association also is to help fellow Christians to think about these topics and just bringing, emphasis to all of this. How's everything going with that?
I think it's good. I think in the last few years, what we've seen is a real uptick in interest in the Christian world at large in being able to think about these things. And I've been really impressed with how rapidly people have been able to kind of jump forward and say, okay, yeah, this is the kind of stuff we need to be thinking about. This is the kind of stuff we need to be really focusing energy and attention on. I think the Christian world is increasingly ready for it. And, definitely like 20 years ago when I was a kid, like first getting interested in this stuff, it was way different. But I think people are realizing, yeah, this is stuff that actually matters. And importantly, the people who are engaged in this, the people who are engaged in that discussion 20 years ago are the ones who shaped what it is today. And the people who are engaged in it today are going to shape what it is 10, 15, 20 years from now. And that's going to be a big deal. And so I think people are starting to realize that we can make a difference if we get engaged with it now. And I think, that message is starting to be heard.
I remember the first time I met you. I actually didn't speak English that well, but I actually understood things. I could understand you. And when you were talking about, technology, science, I was very interested in science, but, technology is something that for me, and it seems that maybe for many people, it's just something that is there, right? But you don't think about it in terms of morals or assumptions about
Right.
where it could go.
Right.
And it's interesting because you put a seed in my brain, and then I started kind of analyzing stuff. For example, when I spend 30 minutes without even thinking on my phone.
Yeah.
And then I started analyzing all of this, saying we don't talk about technology, but technology is not a thing that we approach that is just outside of life. Technology has crept in to the point that it's just part of our lives. So it is so important to talk about these topics at any level of the conversation. So I encourage you to keep going with those conversations because those are very important. So, Micah,
thank you.
Definitely thank you for all that amazing information. So, I don't know if you know, there is a virus out there.
I might have heard about this.
And of course, we're smiling because we want to be positive about this. But of course, there are many people suffering because of this. I tend to be positive, although I know people that, have lost jobs. My wife actually has lost a little bit of her job. She's a dog trainer. and of course she cannot spend time with clients at this moment and all of this.
Yeah.
But that's nothing. People are just, you know, dying. They cannot spend time with people that they love, and it's just incredible what is happening. And I would like to get first your impressions about this, and then ask you about a few things that I've seen. I would love to hear your thoughts about those things. So what do you think? What's your impression about everything that is happening?
Yeah, it's a big deal, and it's really a historic kind of moment. So one of the things that I really have noticed is that people in the tech world, and particularly the transhumanist world, were really attuned to the virus becoming a big deal a long time before other people were.
Mm.
And they were talking about it, and people were like, even journalists were kind of like writing them up and kind of making fun of them and like stuff like this, like the paranoia or whatever. But what it is because transhumanists, especially, and tech people in general, have a different relationship with exponential curves. And so an exponential curve, you think about like the traditional version of the story of this is like a lily pad on a pond. Like one day you have one, the next day you have two, the next day you have four, and you think, oh, it's no big deal. But then pretty soon you have 8, 16, 32, 64, 100. And then one day, like it goes from, oh, it's half covered to now the next day it's all covered,
Wow.
And so exponentials, whenever you get something started doubling or whatever, like those curves just take off. And they start really small and they don't seem like a big deal, and all of a sudden they skyrocket. And this is a big deal in computer technology because this is something called Moore's law, which has driven computer processing power for the last 50 years roughly, which for most of the time we've had computers is basically every 18 to 24 months the processing power available on a single chip would double.
Wow.
And so that's why like we have all this crazy technology today that we didn't 50 years ago, is we went from the kind of computers my grandmother would program, which took up buildings, to like now they can exist in your ears or whatever, like this is and so computer people, tech people, transhumanists are really big into like thinking about where do exponentials lead. And so as soon as they started seeing this virus, a lot of people I know were like, okay, this is where it's going.
Wow.
And people were still saying, well, it's just 3 people, it's just 6 people, it's just 12 people, like no big deal. And they're like, no, it doesn't matter the numbers, it doesn't matter, it's the curve. And a big part of this is that we are just kind of hardwired to think about those numbers. We're like, oh, it's just 12 people, right? Even like they probably said this about Jesus. Oh, he's only got 12 people, right? Like, no big deal. We don't need to think about this, right? But we know that what happens over time is those 12 double and double and double and double, and pretty soon it's billions of people. And that's the thing when you get an exponential. We're just hardwired not to think in that way, but the real way that so many of these things work is they just take off. And so that's one of the things I think is really a helpful lesson when tech people talk about some of these things, like, oh, this is coming, like we're like, but actually this is a great example of where people were like plugged in and they said, no, this is what this curve means. And so I think we've seen just how it got a lot more severe a lot faster than a lot of people expected. And so that's part of it. I think one of the things that we have to think about, one of the reasons this is historic, is because this is the first time in history we've really been at the beginning of a new illness or whatever, and been able to say, okay, what could we do to stop this? Like, what could we do to keep this from becoming a problem before it really becomes like a huge, the next Black Death or whatever? Like, what could we do? And now that we live in this globally connected world, I don't think we think about this enough. Like, we live in a world that is so tightly connected. that you post a dumb meme on Facebook today, and somebody on the other side of the world could start a riot based on it tomorrow.
It
Like,
is.
like that's the kind of thing. And so, like, the what that means is we have to really think about what that looks like. Because we're exposed to much bigger dangers than we've ever been exposed to, because we've never had to really think about that. And so this illness is actually, not to put a kind of pessimistic spin on it, but it's not the worst thing that will come. Like, there are worse things that will come down the line. And what is great about this is that we've had the opportunity to kind of stress test so much of our systems and society and say, okay, how are we going to handle the next thing? And the next thing after that. So yeah, there's a lot more to be said, but that's kind of like some of the initial impressions.
Yeah, I think Micah, I'm no expert at all, but saying that bad things are going to come or worse things are going to come in the future is not actually pessimistic. It's just, we just need to read a few books of history and read a few chapters to see that, things happen in the world. So, okay. So thank you for that. That was very interesting. So that was the analytical side in terms of statistics, and that is so interesting. Actually, everyone is becoming an expert on curves, in these days. What about you as a Christian thinker, and how this is affecting Christian friends and the Christian church? What things are you seeing there that are worth mentioning?
Yeah. So, a big thing, of course, for a lot of people, a big thing that has been happening just over the last month or so has been this move to experiencing church or worship or preaching or whatever digitally, right? Doing it online, right? And that's both something that Christians have been kind of moving towards for a long time, right? We have, we've had televangelists for a long time. We've had that kind of stuff, but it's also like, it's a new experience, right? And we've essentially been thrown into it, right? And we've been thrown into it to the extent where the least technologically literate people are often the most affected. And so I've seen a lot of pastors and preachers and so forth who are spending a lot of time helping older members of their community learn how to use these tools, right? Learn how to use these technologies. And I think it raises all kinds of questions. I see a lot of people, theological discussions about it and so forth, about like what it entails. But one thing that I've seen that is really interesting and counterintuitive is somebody was talking about the fact that, okay, so these churches are kind of broadcasting their worship services online. People are doing this. In that kind of environment, you think, oh, well, people are just going to kind of surf around, right? Like, find the most entertaining version of this, right? Something like that. And they said, but that's not actually what we're seeing. What we're seeing is that instead of treating it as just kind of a consumer item, they are looking for ways to actually connect with their community more. And I think we've seen this because the internet and social media and all this is not broadcast television, right? It's not actually a situation where it's set up for a televangelist to preach to us. It's actually a horizontal medium, right? It's a networked medium. And so that opens up all kinds of new things. And what it does, I think, is it really reinforces the concept and the importance of what we would have called, a month ago, local community. But those local relationships. And I think what we're seeing is we're seeing new ways to use the technology to actually enhance that in some ways beyond what we were doing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
if you think about like a church building, that's a technology, pews, that's a technology, microphones, that's a technology. And we've set up our kind of modern church world mostly to focus on kind of like broadcast or like a concert or something like that, right? There's somebody at the front and
Yeah.
they're kind of broadcasting, and we're sitting in the pews and we're kind of looking at the back of each other's heads, right? So now you shift to, okay, now we're doing like a class or a meeting or some kind of worship experience via Zoom,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where maybe now, instead of looking at the back of people's heads and one person who's broadcasting, maybe now we're actually looking at 10 or 20 or 50 different people's faces and
Wow.
actually experiencing what they're experiencing, right? Being able to connect with them in a way that we haven't ever done, right?
Mm-hmm.
That in these kinds of settings, in these kinds of services. And I see this like creating a different dynamic where, people will, uh, people maybe they'll watch along and they're saying things to each other, right?
Yeah.
um and of course it's not off topic things, it's on topic things, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's driving towards like what are we doing here. And when we're having that kind of um class or whatever where we're all looking at each other and interacting with each other in a way that's different than just text-based social media, right? We're getting back some of that kind of like empathetic facial response, that kind of stuff. So I think what this does is it opens up a real awareness of the fact that we all need community, that we all need connection, and that in some cases is more significant than just kind of tuning into the right message or whatever. We need to be connected with other people.
Yeah.
I think that's the ironic thing that we're seeing here, is that people are really kind of becoming aware of that and looking for ways to really kind of dig into that and say, how can
Mm-hmm.
we intensify this? And when things go back to normal, whenever that is, how do we carry this with us?
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. One of the things that I'm thinking about, Micah, is at the beginning of this, uncharted process, um, people were thinking at churches, people were thinking, well, actually, I would say the world, but well, we're
Mhm.
talking about the Christian church at this moment, like, let's adapt to this situation and
Mhm.
then let's get back to normal. But I think the
Mhm.
situation is actually pushing people to not adapt, but to change
Yeah.
and just to
Yeah.
become something different.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, I have the privilege to be part of a church family and work with them now, and I think everyone is learning new ways to connect with people, and I don't foresee when everything comes back to normal just abandoning all this new knowledge and new ways just
Yeah.
because now we can be together. One thing I would like to mention too, and I would like to hear your thoughts on this, is that technology, of course, I hear Christian friends and preachers saying thanks God for technology, and I always think
Mhm.
Micah was there, but you didn't listen to him before. But one of the things that I see too is um, the internet is helping us,
Mhm.
be connected and express our ideas and all of this. But then at the same time, because we're spending more time on the internet, not actually individually but
Mhm.
in groups and connecting, people
Mhm.
are also realizing that the internet, if we only had the internet to communicate, the
Mhm.
internet doesn't give us, maybe I'm just putting in the question on the comments, of course, my forgive me if I'm doing this, I think I'm doing that, just giving my opinion, but like, we actually lack the this is not enough for a human being. We just
Mhm.
need to be together, right? This is
Mhm.
good. I hear in many conversations, this is amazing, but there's something about being together that is different. Would
Mhm.
you add any thoughts to this, or maybe you have heard about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, so for when I talk to tech people about this, I like to say the issue is bandwidth. Um, because we have a certain bandwidth via like a video call or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but when we're in person, we have a much higher bandwidth, right? We're communicating in a much fuller, richer way.
Mm.
You know, and so that is, yeah, that's absolutely true. So we want that, right? And that doesn't, our desire for that doesn't go away. Um, what something like this gives us the opportunity to do is to rethink how we're using that
Mm.
versus how we're using other things. So, we can talk more about this, but one of the things I think will change from here is that, not that we say, okay, well, physical space doesn't matter. We'll actually say physical space matters more than we thought it did.
Mm.
And maybe it matters so much we shouldn't be using it in the way that we did, right? Like, maybe we should separate these things in some ways, right?
Mm.
And so, a very simple example is a lot of people, including my wife, are learning to like work from home for the first time ever,
Yeah.
right? And when you do that, you say, okay, well, that's where I work, and that's where I eat, and that's where I sleep. These are too close together, right? Like, maybe I need to separate these. Maybe I need to think about these differently. And so I think we're becoming aware of just how important space is. And what I expect is that a lot of people are going to say, you know what? I wasn't paying enough attention to the physical space, the physical connections I was making.
Mm.
I was maybe using them frivolously, and I should have been using them in a more conscious way, something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
That is very interesting, Micah. Uh, Before we draw this interview to a close, I don't want to miss the opportunity to ask you about something, because usually when we think about the future, then we think about the future in terms of hope and emotions, and sometimes actually fear, of course, and the unknown. But I think that people like you, Micah, you guys actually think about the future analytically. Actually, you observe what has happened in the past, and then you try to think about the future, not just something ambiguous that is just there, just coming, but just
Mm-hmm.
actually putting all the steps together in a path, on a path, and then just where is this going to lead us? So, I would like to ask you two questions, and I know that you have touched
Mm-hmm.
a little bit on this already, but I would like to just give you some time to explore this. So, my first question for you is, how do you think this is going to change the Christian church? And my second question is, how do you think this is going to change the world? I know these are very big questions, but just a few thoughts about the first one, the
Yeah.
Christian church, and then we'll finish with a few thoughts about what you think this is going to entail for the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think, like we were talking about a bit ago, like, I think it's going to really um, change our notion of community
Mm.
and connection in that way. I think, but in both ways. Right now, we're going to have a much greater consciousness of what it means to be using a space,
Okay.
and being together in a space. And I anticipate, even within physical church buildings, going forward, people are going to think a lot more about what that is, and maybe desiring more physical connection.
Mm.
Um, if you look at like Catholic churches, Eastern Orthodox churches, these old churches, a lot of the things that they do are very physical, because they've gone through 1,000 years of plagues,
Yeah.
famines, like all this kind of stuff, right? Literacy and not literacy and all this kind of, and they are very oriented towards, what is this physical space like? And I think that we're going to develop a consciousness of that. So I think that's one thing. I think the importance of connection, even when we're remote, even when we're removed, is going to be increased. And I think people, like you said, are going to say, okay, this has got to become something that's bigger than it was, more
Mm.
connected than it was. And I think that's, I think, the church in America and the kind of European world, Western world, has been struggling for a long time, and it's declining precipitously in the last few years.
Mm.
And I think this goes back to the breakdown of science and faith dialogue, really. I think it all comes back to that. And I think what we're seeing now is that there's this huge interest in science, medicine, technology. People are like, oh yeah, if we want to take a newly discovered virus and develop a vaccine for it as quickly as possible, what does that mean? Well, it means we have to mobilize hundreds and thousands of scientists and mobilize, tens and hundreds of thousands of people who've been working on this stuff for years, right? Like, this stuff has been going on, and thanks to them, we'll be able to roll something out. And that means, well, that's something we need to be thinking about all along. We don't need to just wait, And so that interest, realizing, oh yeah, as a society, we have to be supporting science and technology and medical research, and not just as like something we kind of have to do, but actually as something that's part of our human mission, part of like what we're doing to help people, like alleviate suffering and so if we do that, if we think about that as Christians, then I think that changes our relationship to science, and it starts to give us a way to talk about that kind of relationship in a way that maybe can change some of the decline we've been seeing. That's my hope anyway. So that's what I would say about church. I can talk some about society too.
Yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts. I think if we had a non-Christian skeptic friend here, would challenge what I'm going to say. But of course, I think prayer is incredible. Having the opportunity to have conversations with, the creator of the universe. But at the same time, I agree with you. Like, the fact that we have a mind in order to transform the world, that is the image of God. So transforming the world through the things that we're doing, being creative and transforming technology, because we actually, even we think, whether we think or we don't think we're doing it, we actually are doing it already,
Yeah.
And I think all this data, what it's going to do is to give us more options to think in different ways and patterns as to how to approach this. So that's a beautiful way to think about it. So yeah, Micah, would you share a few thoughts about what you think this is, how this is going to, move the world further?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of workspaces, that just the obvious thing, like you know, remote work is going to become a much bigger part of society. And part of the reason it's going to become a much bigger part of society is because now the places that can do remote work don't have an excuse anymore, because they've already had to figure out how to do it. They've had to figure out how to find those tools, find that kind of stuff. And so I think that means that there are a lot of benefits to going to remote offices and that kind of stuff. And so a huge number of companies are going to be like, well, okay, we've done it. We can't say no now, for whatever cultural, that's the main reason we haven't been doing it for a long time. But so we're going to shift to where remote first becomes a much more prominent thing. And if we do that, then what it means is that we're going to think a lot more about the space we live in and how we use that and how we, allocate that kind of, those kind of resources and so forth. We're going to think a lot more about like the importance of everyone having high-speed internet. That's a silly thing in a sense, and yet it's considered a luxury item now. But if the government tells us we have to shut down our society, like, that's not going to be a luxury item anymore, right? So I think you're going to see a lot of that. I think with that, we're going to see some big changes in the physical spaces. I was just saying today, a company with 50,000 employees is tearing down their open workspace and re-erecting cubicles, right? Because cubicles are more self-contained. It's more of a private space. We're not worried as much about contagion, all this kind of stuff. And so a lot of the things that have been like trends in the corporate world for, a few decades or whatever, those are going to go away, and people are going to really say, okay, maybe that was a bad idea. Let's rethink this. I think on a bigger scale, more importantly, I think what this really drives home is that we really do need to be prepared, and building a resilient society, right? And like you said, like we just look at history, huge things have come along that most of us have never experienced in our lifetime, right? But now we're in a global world where that's even more dangerous than it's ever been. And so, you know, some people found the decision to say, okay, everybody's got to stay at home or whatever, you know, like, I mean, it puts a real strain on a lot of people. I don't want to diminish that, but it also drives home the fact that, well, in a sense, we have to have society that way, right? Like we have to build our society so that when we have a crisis, we can say, okay, we're going to stop working in this way and we're going to start working in this way, or we're going to stop doing this.
Wow.
And we're, you know, and I mean, our ancestors worked that way. They knew when the Vikings came by, they were going to have to hide, you know, like they're, you know, like everybody knows this stuff, right? We've kind of forgotten some of the ways we have to like prepare for those things. So I think we're going to become much more. So here's a great example. During the Cold War, the U.S. government was very concerned what would happen if a nuclear missile was aimed at the United States and disrupted communication so that suddenly the one part of the government couldn't communicate with another part. And so they said, okay, what could we do about this? And they said, well, we would have to build a kind of communication network that had no single point of failure. And they started sculpting this out, and they built something that was originally called DARPANET, and that grew into the internet today, right?
Yeah.
They built the internet out of response to how do we make our society more resilient, right? And nobody thought when they were building that, oh, this is going to become the way we, you know, shop and share pictures of kitty cats.
Wow.
And, you know, like all this. But that was the foundation for a huge new kind of, you know, economy, society, all that. When we build our systems resilient, that's the kind of thing that comes out of it. So I think that's what is on the verge of happening when we say, okay, we've got to build our society more resilient to prepare for this kind of stuff. And what we're going to see is a flourishing of new creativity, new technologies, new culture, new economy, all this kind of new possibility opening up.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah, definitely. Well, Micah, it has been a pleasure to have you here. Do you have any thoughts you want to finish with?
I think it's just really important to be thinking about this stuff and talking about it. And, you know, this is, you know, we all live in this world. Like technology is not something that's just, you know, happening somewhere. It's something we're all contributing to. We're all helping to build, whether we realize it or not. So it's important to be doing that consciously, to be doing that thoughtfully, to be bringing our values and best kind of visions and so forth into it. And, you know, if you're a Christian, to be doing so from a position of like, well, what does it mean to be made in the image of God? How do I bring that into it? And not just be someone who's like, okay, well, you know, whatever, you know, the latest thing is, that's what I'll have. Like that's a passive way to engage. And I think that we need to move beyond that and move into a more active, thoughtful, conscious way to engage with technology and science and all that kind of stuff. So yeah.
That is very interesting, Micah. Before I finish, just want to share a thought with you. This world pandemic is causing people to actually do great things, to come together, to work together, as you're saying. And we see doctors, nurses, and people just, you know, putting the economy down because we care about life more than economy. And it reminds me as a Christian, when I'm reading the Old Testament and we see our Jewish brothers just doing something wrong and then learning from it, and then doing something wrong and then learning from it. And and again, it's interesting because you read about the past saying, okay, so they did this again and they did it, and this is happening now. It seems that a world pandemic was needed in order for people to you know, to grasp the importance of keep being creative and being
Mm-hmm.
connected and all of this is very interesting. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
reading that Christians and skeptics would do about this would be different, of course, but
Mm-hmm.
that's why we're here, to have good conversations
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Micah, for being here with us. And for everyone watching the show, I'll share information in the description about Micah and the Christian Transhumanist Association. If you guys have questions about this, please email Micah. Micah and his association, the Christian Transhumanist Association, is always open to have great conversations about all of this. And as you guys see, they have amazing topics and opinions about everything that is happening, has happened, and is potentially happening in the future.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Micah.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's been great to be here. Great talking with you, Pedro. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And I'll see you guys in our next episode. Thank you very much.